Mr. Zlotnick, and then Mr. Wilson. Mr. Zlotnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greg Zlotnick, State and Federal Contractors, and also in response to Councilmember Johnson, that it was over nice and quick. A few things. First of all, I appreciate the discussion. A lot of some of the detail that was raised and the back and forth was useful in sort of clarifying what was on the page and providing some higher level of comfort. I know maybe you don't want to hear that. I shouldn't have. Now he's nervous. I would like to just remind the council, and I appreciate the staff attaching it to the memo, Tara Mueller's memo from the AG's office, and just this sort of strange construct that you've identified about being a responsible agency, but unlike most responsible agencies, you're not really implementing any of the project that you're going to be commenting on. And it does make a big difference in terms of just, and this is with your consultant as well, sort of opining generally and raising questions and issues that you'd like responses to about how things are being dealt with is very different than undertaking a deep analysis that a regular responsible agency might do because they got to actually undertake part of the project. And so we think that's a distinction that's important to keep in mind as you go forward. And I appreciate Chris's comments about the comments not being your consultants but being the council's, and not that anyone on this council would, but certainly we hope when the time comes, and there's going to be a time crunch because this is going to be sort of happening at the same time your process is happening, that certainly you don't abdicate those conclusions. And as the memo indicates from Tara, there have to be specific findings included. And so that's an important part of it. With regard to the questions on the second page of the memo, and again, appreciate some of the comments. One of the things also I think that's unique about this process as opposed to, for example, when I was on the board at Santa Clara and we were a responsible agency every now and then for some projects that were undertaken, is oftentimes, or most of the time, those projects were done kind of over here and you never really saw it until it got spit out, and you sort of were dealing with sort of more of a black box process, and just BDCP has not been that. Some might argue otherwise, but the fact is it's been a very public process with lots and lots of public input and review of questions to the tune of, where are we, 6-7 years now, and hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think that's an important consideration as well. On the financing question, I'm just kind of curious. Dan made a comment, I believe, about how does this fit into the bigger package of financial needs? How does BDCP fit into that? And I think in the consultative role, and he brought that up about sort of talking with the area, how is this going to work? I think certainly that makes sense, but I think it's important to note that BDCP is not technically part of this bigger question as reflected here about how does it consider the cost of other actions, additional storage, this, that, and the other thing. I mean, that's just not BDCP, and it shouldn't be held accountable for that as part of the broader discussion of how the whole system is going to work. Similarly, on the Delta governance, and again, Dan mentioned this was more to have, how is it going to work overall. But on the page here, it talks about is it or can it be adequately integrated with other elements of the Delta plan? And I would just remind folks that assuming it gets certified by Fish and Game and survives an appeal here, that it is consistent with, it will be part of the Delta plan, consistent with the Delta plan, and we'll just have to figure out a way for it to work. It's not something that can be necessarily required to fit over here if it's already been approved as part of its own governance structure. And that's, I think, something you can work through in the conversation, certainly, but it's just a question of the wording. And then in terms of the engineering review, very much appreciate the comments. There was some point like, what are you going to review? Because at this point, there's not a whole lot of engineering to look at. And so the conversation that will be something that will probably take place down the road and more along the lines of again, I would argue sort of a check-in on what it is and what the fundamentals of it are and how it's substantiated, et cetera. Again, is a sort of a different context than a sort of review of whether it's the right thing to do or not. And that would be of concern, obviously, because we don't think that would be appropriate, and it's not part of CEQA anyway at that level. So with that, again, I appreciate the comments and the conversation, and hope we're on the right track. And in terms of the ISB's review and the charge, we think it's a good charge, lots of good questions to be looked at, and look forward to that process going forward.
Thank you, sir.